Hi, my name is Dave, and this is a presentation I put together for you on the scientific evidence surrounding Jesus' crucifixion as well as his resurrection. And then with that, we're going to jump right into the agenda. Okay, so on the very first slide, what we're going to do is talk about a couple of key things. We're going to talk about Jesus' ministry and how the spread of Christianity really happened throughout the world. We're also going to get into two artifacts in particular related to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. One is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is basically a face cloth that went over Jesus' face right after he's crucified. The other one is known as the Shroud of Turin. So it's a cloth that resides in Turin, Italy, and it's a very big cloth and really kind of covers the front as well as back of Jesus when he's placed in the tomb as a part of his burial process. We're then going to talk about how some of the scientific evidence on these artifacts relates to the Gospels themselves. In particular, we're going to be talking to the New Testament and some of the Gospel readings in it that are by Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, and again, how that scientific evidence is related to those Gospels. And again, this is kind of a critical point because the Gospels themselves were written about 2,000 years earlier than the scientific evidence itself. Lastly, we're going to have a couple of conclusions and things to think about as we wrap up the presentation. And with that, we're going to go ahead and roll into the next slide and talk a little bit about Christianity and why it really spread. So first of all, when you look at Christianity in the first couple hundred years, it was pretty tough. While Jesus left us with some good things to think about, he actually has his teachings, which encapsulated pretty much how humanity should really conduct themselves and how we should treat each other. Next, there are a number of miracles that are related to Jesus. So again, these miracles are pretty important to establishing Jesus kind of a major player in that time frame. Next, we're going to talk a bit about how Jesus, and he was really predicted. If you think about the Old Testament, which came before the New Testament, the Old Testament really kind of talks about the Messiah, which is really the coming of Jesus. And lastly, we're going to talk about, again, how the evidence is really related to the New Testament and the readings specifically by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And we're going to have some conclusions and things to think about after that. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the evidence. All right. So when we talk about Christianity and basically how it spread, it was really kind of spread by the people that really followed Jesus in the early days. So if you think about this, it was his apostles and disciples. Both men and women really kind of like followed Jesus back in those days. And again, as I indicated, life was kind of tough because if you actually followed Jesus' ministry, you could really be crucified for it, or you could be martyred for it. And a lot of these people are known as martyrs, which is another way of saying that people would die because of their belief in Christianity and their belief in Jesus. And so again, the first couple of hundred years after Jesus were kind of tough. What really happened, which really is about the 313 AD, when Constantine was the emperor of the Roman Empire at the time, things really kind of changed quite a bit. For Constantine, he fundamentally put something else into law, which is called the Edict of Milan. And the Edict of Milan was really a new law that basically said that people could follow any religion that they liked. And so this was a big turn-in. In fact, Constantine himself was baptized as a Christian. So realistically, if you look at the picture on the slide, you're going to see basically an outline of the Roman Empire, and which had about 300 million people at the time. And it was really after Constantine was baptized as a Christian that the spread of Christianity really kind of flourished throughout the world, or most of it was known as the Roman Empire at that point in time, but it really flourished and allowed it to gain the popularity it did today. The other thing that was important when it came to Christianity was realistically, again, the miracles and the teachings by Jesus. But those are the real things that kind of helped to flourish throughout the world. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the artifacts that are associated with Jesus. So on the screen, you're going to see a couple of different artifacts. On the far right-hand side is something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. The Sudarium is basically a cloth that covered Jesus' face when he was crucified. And this is important because on the cloth, you can actually see that there are a number of stains, both including sweat stains as well as blood stains that were kind of captured when they put this cloth and wrapped it around Jesus' head. The other artifact is a very different artifact. It's known as the Shroud of Turin, and the main reason it doesn't look like the Sudarium on the right side is that this is realistically a picture of the cloth itself. And what was interesting about that is about the 1800 period photography came around, and this is a digital camera, but a lot of the older, I would say, film cameras of like 20, 30 years ago looked a lot like this particular camera today. The big difference is that really kind of made this image quite interesting is the fact that the Sudarium itself is just, again, a face cloth that kind of covers Jesus, has blood stains and sweat stains. When you look at the Shroud of Turin, actually there's something different in it, and it's one unique, one-of-a-kind type of cloth out there that it captures 3D imagery actually on the cloth itself, which is pretty important because when that 3D imagery was exposed to film camera, you basically had a negative image on the cloth itself. And you also had another negative image that was taking a picture of it, and fundamentally what happened was that it formed a positive image. And that positive image, as you can see on the screen, captured a lot of interesting details. First off, if you look at the face, you're going to see that you have evidence of that a crown was actually on top of Jesus' head. Any of those white dots on his face really represent blood stains, which are pretty important because they correlate directly back to the evidence that we see in the Gospels themselves. You're also going to see that Jesus was bruised underneath one of his eyes. He was actually tortured before he was crucified. And if you look at the picture of his body, you're going to see a lot of white marks around his body. One thing I will mention is the Romans are very, very good at torture. And Jesus was tortured fairly heavily before he was actually crucified. In fact, the reason he has all those white marks all over his body is that the Romans whipped him with a whip that's about 2 feet long. The big difference between this whip and a lot of other whips is that it not only had leather tethers on it, but those tethers actually had metal balls attached to them. And one of the things, again, that the Romans are known for is their torture. Kind of a brutal thing to actually be known for, but all these things actually point towards what the Gospels are saying about Jesus, that he was tortured, then crucified. And so all these little white marks all over his body are evidence as crucifixion. The other thing that's kind of important is when you look at him, you'll see the white marks on his wrist. That's actually where the metal pins were driven through his wrist to pin him to the cross before he was crucified. There's also similar ones that are on the feet region. And again, the interesting thing about it is even from a Roman perspective, that wasn't enough from a torture perspective. They actually pinned Jesus in such a way, or anybody else who was being crucified, such that you'd actually lift your body up by your legs in order to stop from suffocating. And when you finally gave up or you didn't have enough energy to do that from being on the cross such a long time, you actually died of suffocation. Your actual lungs would fill up with fluid, usually water and blood, and then after that point in time, you die through suffocation. So he did all this for us. This is a way of kind of like building a new relationship with God so that Jesus would actually die for all humanity's sins and that we could go forward with a new relationship with God, which is one that, yes, all humans sin, but we can actually be forgiven those sins and have this different relationship with God versus what it was before. And Jesus was the guy that really kind of set all this in motion for us. So with that, let's kind of talk about the evidence a little bit more. So again, 2 artifacts out there. When we get to the Sudarium, basically a lot of the research done around the Sudarium is related to certain things about the Sudarium or certain characteristics. One, the blood type being AB on the Sudarium as well as on the Shroud. Why this is important is it's a very rare blood type. AB is known for being about 3 to 4% of the world population from a blood type perspective. And this is critical because of the fact that AB was also only known to exist in around the Judea area. It was more prevalent there than it ever was in Europe, especially at this time frame. So, and it resided on both claws. So if you're thinking about something, oh, I'm going to build a forgery, well, it's going to be tough to actually build a forgery using AB negative or AB blood type on actually both particular claws. The other thing that's important, it's actually not in the text here, but it's in actually the research, is the fact that that pollen that was on both claws has actually been tested. It's known to be of this Judea region, otherwise known as modern Israel today. Also, the weave in the cloth was a herringbone type, again, popular at that time frame. The cloth itself is known to be of origins to that particular time frame and that type of cloth that was available in the 1st century. The other thing that's probably the most important between these 2 cloths is that when you kind of overlay them, if I'm going to take the Sudarium and overlay it directly on top of the Turin, you're going to find that there are about 70 points of references that are same between the 2, including the nose, the fact that the person in both cloths had a beard, had long hair, had a mustache. If you look at the white markings basically left behind from the crucifixion as well as the torture that went on prior to that, again, these correlate directly to each other. And when you talk about 70 correlations on the front, about 50 on the back, most researchers basically state that it is impossible to think that these 2 are actually on a different person. They're on fundamentally the same person. So that's where the research has gone. That's what the research tells us. But I think even more so, as we think about moving on from the evidence that's actually on the Sudarium, we're going to move on to the Shroud of Turin. And again, if you look at the Shroud of Turin and the evidence left behind it, from an authenticity perspective as well as kind of, is this real? Is it something that can be forged? That type of thing. It's a pretty unique piece of cloth. That is, that it's the only known cloth in the history of the world that has 3D evidence really kind of tied to it. And if you think about that, in Jesus' time, there's about 300 million in population. This is a 1 in 300 million type of artifact for that period. So it's a very, very unique thing. The other thing that's unique about the Shroud of Turin is the fact that even with today's science and scientific capabilities, we can't reproduce it. We know that some sort of high energy birth actually produced it that can't be replicated. So if you think about this in terms of a revelation or in terms of like the resurrection specifically, it's tough to deny the fact that we can't produce something like this today, but yet this event happened and happened approximately 2,000 years ago based on the evidence on the shroud itself. So again, pretty critical thing when you think about in terms of like, is this something I should believe in? Is this something that, you know, I should really kind of think twice about when it comes to Jesus, his crucifixion, as well as his resurrection and teachings he left behind? Is the fact that this evidence points to the fact that, yes, Jesus was real. Yes, there was a crucifixion. Yes, there was probably a resurrection of a supernatural event that we can't explain. And if I look back at the Gospels themselves, which we're going to talk about shortly, it's probably something we should be paying attention to. All right, so with that, let's move on to the Gospels a little bit. And again, talk about the correlating evidence. And the correlating evidence between the shroud as well as the Sudarium is important when it comes to Gospels because the scientific evidence wasn't produced until approximately 2,000 years later. That's a big deal. That science came around 2,000 years later to actually help explain what this is all about and correlates again directly to the Gospels themselves. I'm not going to read all these to you, but if you're going to point out the big things, I just picked out the Gospel readings that are kind of related to Jesus' trials, crucifixion, as well as his resurrection. But again, if you look at the science evidence, it tracks very, very closely to the Gospels themselves, which, by the way, can lead us to new conclusions that we might want to pay attention to. So specific to that, what do we really want to kind of conclude out of this? The fact that one of the important things is the scientific evidence came around 2,000 years after the Gospels themselves. The Gospels themselves are a pretty accurate representation of what actually happened from a scientific perspective. And from that perspective, we can probably assume that the other Gospel readings are pretty accurate. Again, something we should kind of pay attention to. So from a parting conclusion, that's what I really want to leave people with, is that we've made the case that actually the evidence is good, the evidence is authentic around the two artifacts, the evidence correlates to not only themselves, but the Gospels, but also in terms of that, we probably want to pay attention to the Gospels themselves. So what are some of the key teachings that Jesus actually left behind for us? Number one is that we should basically love God with all of our heart and all of our mind and all of our soul. And I realize that can be difficult because that's not the really same thing as having a relationship with our neighbor or our spouse or a family. So how do we really interpret that one? Well, Jesus left a hint for us on that one, where he basically said, in the same way that you should try and love God, you should actually love your neighbor the same way. And by the way, neighbor means not just those people we love, but those people we might not necessarily agree with. He wasn't discriminating about the fact that we have to, different groups that we want to love versus don't love. This is universal. We love everybody and try and do the best you can at it. The other thing that he left behind us with is the golden rule, which is basically treat unto others so we should treat ourselves. Again, if you look at all this stuff, it's really kind of like, again, a guidebook to humanity, how we should treat others. So a real critical thing there. A couple other things that we want to talk about are really in this slide or the next slide. Whereas Jesus teaches against greed, we should try and avoid greed whenever possible. The other thing that he talks about is you should be a little bit frightened about being too wealthy in this world. In fact, the saying that Jesus leaves behind is that, you know, it's more difficult to get to heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, which is a pretty big deal. So I think it applies to every one of us in their everyday life, is the fact that not everybody is really kind of well off as us. Then we should think about sharing that wealth with others as well. So again, not just for the ultra-rich, but really for everybody. A couple other big ones is that you should try and store up your treasures in heaven. What Jesus is basically saying is do unto others, do the good things to them. Those are treasures in heaven. And you should be more concerned about those than actually getting super wealthy or kind of be concerned about yourself. And the last thing he actually leaves us with is the fact that Jesus was put on earth to serve others. You know, he wasn't here to be king of everybody. He basically came to help serve others and do good unto others. And that's what his life was really about before he was crucified. So some big things. A couple of things that I'm leaving you with are really the reference materials. You know, where can you find out more information? What can you watch? That's kind of interesting. There's a video on Prime that's all about the Gospels that I have at the bottom of this page, which is kind of interesting because it's really kind of set not only the Gospels, but also the time of the Gospels and where the narrator actually brings you to the region where the Gospels are written. So I think it's pretty cool and pretty interesting. The other one is the research itself. Again, a number of references here that you can kind of take a look at where the detailed references on the crucifixion, the artifacts that I spoke about. But hopefully, in a summary of that, you'll find this interesting, you'll find it useful, and hopefully it'll lead to something else from a journey of exploration for you. Thanks, and have a great day.